So we have some pretty breaking news from a federal judge. We have confirmation that the Trump administration is indeed willfully violating a court order to unfreeze federal spending. We may indeed be in the midst of a constitutional crisis because it seems that the Trump administration is defying the courts for partisan political reasons. And to unpack this breaking news, I brought in an attorney, my friend and yours, and my co-host of Live and Learn every week on Wednesdays. Pisco, what the hell is going on? It seems like you've been proven correct.
Thank you, Josiah. Yeah, and appreciate again being on your show. It is a constitutional crisis, as I said in our earlier interaction and in a debate I had last week. The Trump administration is gearing up to attack not just Article 1 and the Congress, but the courts as well, and to unify and centralize power in the executive branch. And now you have perfect confirmation of it. We all sort of saw some of the litigation that was going on this unconstitutional spending freeze that Trump had implemented earlier that paused all sorts of federal financial assistance, trillions and trillions of dollars. And that shortly made its way to the courts, where a bunch of states and a bunch of other actors sued, saying this is unconstitutional. You're stealing legislative authority. Congress has the core legislative authority to appropriate bills. This has been recognized for years and years. And if you want to put pauses on funding as a matter of, executives looking at for fraud or pausing it for other legitimate reasons, there are procedures that you need to go through, such as the Impoundment Act, and those were not followed. And so surprisingly, we had some pretty good results from the federal judiciary. I say surprisingly because recently we've had some sort of whoppers from the judiciary, but they've been pretty good on some of these orders and acknowledging their unconstitutionality. And there have been multiple orders, not just one out of DC, one out of the District of Rhode Island, that have put a pause on the spending freeze. And we all kind of saw that, and we saw the Trump administration continuing to pause funds going to certain places. And so now you have an order, a second order from a court directing the administration to comply with the first temporary restraining order, which I think you've put up right there.
Yeah, so let's talk about this for just a second. Actually, I want to say this first, just that way our audience is to whatever question, you're the attorney here. The audience might be wondering, okay, perhaps they're overstating, perhaps they're paraphrasing. I want you to confirm, does the judge specifically say that the Trump administration is violating his initial restraining order? Is that explicit?
Yes, it is explicit. The court starts by saying, hey, quoting that the executive is bound by the determinations of the judiciary branch, right? It starts by laying out foundationally, courts have the right to say what the law is. That's Marbury versus Madison. That's what Article 3 is about. And then further along, it says that the court is finding that the Trump administration is violating the initial TRO. TRO is a temporary restraining order, not optional. And the court also finds that there's no reason for them to be violating the plain terms of the TRO. And so, yes, it is incredibly explicit.
Yeah, so highlighting this for the audience's benefits. The reason I'm saying that, of course, is I just want to be clear that as a political commentator and as a lawyer, Pisco and I are not interpreting. We are just reading verbatim. It is explicit. The Trump administration is violating the plain text of the temporary restraining order. This is, again, you had a debate. You've been going back and forth with people on debate panels and on social media with conservative attorneys very often discussing this. What was the context prior to this issuance by the federal judge out of Rhode Island? What led you to believe that the Trump administration had been, over the past several days, violating the initial restraining order?
Well, it's because they are talking about it, and they're talking about cutting funds in the moment. They're tweeting about it. They're being incredibly blatant about which streams of funds that they're wanting to cut off and additional ones that they are cutting off and shutting down agencies. And so they're being flagrant in the sense that they're on social media. The Elon Musk, who again is head of this purported government office, Doge, is doing all sorts of things that were obviously affecting funding streams. And so I had a deep inclination and suspicion that they were violating the order. And I knew, by the way, that the states and other plaintiffs had sort of raised this in court. I had not commented on it until we got confirmation from the court. But yeah, for me, it was clear that this was on the table. And I knew that eventually there was going to be a standoff with the courts because they have been planning this for a long time. It's in Project 2025. J.D. Vance has talked about it. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, has warned about it. Just this week, J.D. Vance, we were pulling it up right now, tweeted that certain court orders are going to be illegitimate and can't intrude on the executive. That's a clear hearkening back to Project 2025 and this theory of that the executive is above the law and that he wants a king, not a president.
Yeah, so I pulled this tweet up by J.D. Vance, the current vice president of the United States, made just yesterday at 10 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. He says if a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the attorney general and how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. So it does seem to be an attitude pervasive in the Trump administration, and quite frankly, the Republican Party writ large, that judicial review is really, it's a partisan exercise in the sense that judicial review seems to be only valid, Pisco, when it benefits the Republicans. And then the moment it's inconvenient, then we have to have a question about separation of powers, which is interesting because as you and I have discussed repeatedly, as a broad principle, I have genuine concerns, no matter who is president, no matter what the Constitution of the Supreme Court is, with judicial supremacy. This idea that the court has license to issue checks and balances to the other two branches, but can't be checked in turn. I have a huge fucking problem with that. We don't have 9 unelected God kings that issue proclamations from on high. I do believe that the president and Congress should be empowered to check the court as well. I think it has to be reciprocal. I don't think this current Supreme Court interprets it that way. And I want, quite frankly, even a Republican administration, if they were to act in good faith, to bring the Supreme Court to heel, say, no, you will be subject to ethics requirements. You will have a binding code of conduct. We're not going to ask you. We are forcing it on you as the two more powerful branches. But it occurs to me that's not really what J.D. Vance is talking about. He's not talking about...
Here's the difference, Josiah.
Yeah.
You don't think that the president should be above the Congress. All right, there's one thing for you to say the political branches need to have the most power. And it's true that Congress has the power of the purse, the president the power of the sword, and the courts are supposed to have the power of their reason. And recently, reason has been lacking from the Supreme Court. And so I understand some of the frustrations. I actually do. But I have never heard Josiah to argue that the president is both above Congress and the courts, which is what they're doing. Recall what this is all about, right? It's spending freezes, the nebulous thing in your head. Just remember what this is all about. It's about power. Congress is the one who's supposed to pay for things. The president is saying, no, I get to decide. So he's trying to steal legislative authority. And the court is coming in and saying, hey, hold the phone here. You can't take away power from the other branch. And the president is telling him to fuck off. So what we're having here is a constitutional crisis where the executive branch is trying to become an autocracy, where the president is trying to become a king. I wouldn't put it in such stark terms if it weren't happening. And all of my predictions, as you noted, have been vindicated. I was on that debate with some conservative lawyers before. I've been in public discussions before, and they tell me the sky's not falling. There is no problem with the courts. The Trump administration would never defy the courts. And now where are they? They're not, I don't even see them posting anymore. And so we really need to start looking around and seeing who's making sense, who's making the right predictions, and who's calling it correctly about the tenor and actions of this administration. Because it's not the conservatives or the enlightened centrist lawyers who are telling you everything's fine.
So let's unpack that a little bit. So there seems to be this attitude I find among some conservative attorneys, quite frankly, but also people who are just Trump aligned in general, be they attorneys or laymen or others, which is that, well, it only matters when the Supreme Court steps in. So in other words, that the executive, at least when the Republicans are the executive, they have every right to ignore or defy a federal court ruling. But maybe only when the Supreme Court gets involved, that's the final arbitration. Do you accept that basically if somebody were to come to you and say, Pisco, it's okay because the Supreme Court hasn't stepped in, and only once the Supreme Court stepped in and a Republican executive defies the Supreme Court, then we have a constitutional crisis. Then we have a real issue.
Yeah, so no, I do not accept it. Article 3 says the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in a Supreme Court, and as such, inferior courts as Congress may ordain, okay, and establish. So it is absolutely the case that the judicial power of the United States, as referenced in Article 3, is not just the Supreme Court. It is other Article 3 courts that Congress has ordained and established, including the U.S. federal district courts and the U.S. Court of Appeals. And so, no, it is not legitimate for you to violate willfully the orders of a federal judge. There are proper mechanisms and forms of relief that you can take to get to those higher appellate court systems. And in fact, this Supreme Court has bent over backwards to provide those emergency remedies to Trump when they're not appropriate, when they are, in fact, in my opinion, going way beyond the proper, procedures and the proper structure of the law. I'm thinking, of course, of the Trump immunity decision and other cases like that. And they have been quite willing and quite accommodating to Trump in the past. And so this is something different. What's going on here is willful disobedience. It's flagrant disobedience of the court. And it is a constitutional crisis. We need to wake up, folks. We need to wake up and recognize what it is. Because until you recognize that there's a problem, you're not going to fix it. So that's step one, is for people to put their heads on right and recognize that we're in a bad place and we need to get out of it.
So again, to be very clear, this federal judge, John McConnell, out of Rhode Island, his rulings are just as binding on the Trump administration as any other judge, unless those rulings are overturned by a higher authority, which it hasn't been so far, to be clear.
That's correct. The judicial power of the United States is vested in both the Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as Congress may ordain and establish. That has been the law of the land. It is not a advisory opinion. He is ruling on a case or controversy, and the president must be brought to heel. The president must be in accordance with the law, and he must follow it.
Yeah, so again, I just want to refer the audience to the language here, which is that the defendants, which in this case would be the Trump administration, received notice of the TRO, the temporary restraining order. The order is clear and unambiguous, and there are no impediments to the defendant's compliance with the order. This is the judge's determination. The broad categorical and sweeping freeze of federal funds is, as the court found, likely unconstitutional and has caused and continues to cause irreparable harm to a vast portion of the country. These pauses in funding violate the plain text of the TRO. So, again, to be very clear, the judge is finding that this has violated the temporary restraining order that he has imposed on the Trump administration. Did no ambiguity in this whatsoever. Is there, I suppose, again, just to play the devil's advocate here one last time, is there a good faith argument for, is this the only recourse the Trump administration has? Like, listen, we disagree with the judge's interpretation. We disagree. So therefore, we are entitled to violate the TRO because the judiciary is not supreme, right? Certainly the president of the United States is more powerful than any single federal judge. A federal judge can't just unilaterally strike this down. The president, if he disagrees, should be able to contest this. And this is a form of contestation.
There is no good faith argument here. Joe Biden followed through on court orders all the time, despite the lies and protestations. We talked about it before of the student loan thing, which is a complete lie. Joe Biden followed district courts, courts of appeals, and the Supreme Court of the United States. Presidents have done this. There is no excuse. If the president doesn't like what the judge said, he has a very simple option available to him. Trump Republicans control all forms of government in this country. They control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. The reason why Trump does not go to the Congress to pass a law to do what he wants to do, to pause the funding, to give him increased authority to do these kinds of funding stops, right? He could do all manner of thing with the Congress, which he controls. But the reason he can't do that is he knows he doesn't have a mandate for those actions. He knows that the Democratic will, as established in our actual bodies of Congress, would not go for it. That's why he's taking this executive action. And that's why it needs to be executive action, because he's trying to bypass the democratically elected legislative members of Congress and now the courts. And so the only remedy available to him, and he feels, because he doesn't want to be undermined, is to blatantly and openly violate the court's orders, which is what he's done.
That's a great point. He can appeal this. He can comply with the decision while simultaneously appealing it. He has every right to do that. He also has every right to go to Congress, as you say, because his party controls both chambers of Congress, and to try to adjust the spending that way, either its levels or its allocations. You're right. He has two very viable paths before him that, at least on paper, given the right-wing bent of the judiciary and the right-wing bent of the legislature, you would think like, hey, listen, you have two perfectly tenable paths, and he's choosing instead to go with the most blatantly unconstitutional one.
If, by the way, if there's a legitimate fraud issue, if there's a legitimate waste issue, present it to Congress. Go bring your findings to Congress and pause it there. Get a pause from your Congress members, from your speaker, your MAGA Mike Johnson. Get a pause with the Senate, which now is in control of the Republicans. But they won't, because they can't, because they know it's all a sham.
So we'll conclude with this, having again established the fact that the Trump administration is not potentially, but is in fact explicitly violating the judge's order to unfreeze federal spending. Now that we've established that beyond fact, I'm going to give you the final word. Is there anything you would like to say to the conservative attorneys that you've been sparring with for the past several weeks about the Trump administration's compliance with the judiciary?
When you were admitted to practice, you swore an oath to defend and to uphold the law, which is the Constitution and the laws of the states and of the United States. Remember your oath. Call out this blatant, unconstitutional power grab by the administration. I know it's difficult for political reasons, but it is your duty as an officer of the court and as a member of this country to stand up for the republic and defend it from tyrants who want to be kings.
And if you have to, just close your eyes and pretend it's a Democrat doing it, if that makes it better going down. So, Pisco, I appreciate it. Where can people find you?
Pisco's Hour on YouTube. That's PISOSHOUR. I'm also Pisco on Twitch and Pisco Liddy on Twitter.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be talking about this again in the near future.
Thank you, Josiah.